Today, Andrew Amstutz, who is an UW-Mellon postdoctoral fellow here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's part of a cohort. So these UW-Mellon postdoctoral fellowships are actually highly competitive. Hundreds of people apply and 3 get selected. And I'm witness to that because today I can say after a year and a half that I was on the selection committee and we were so impressed by Andrew's application. It's very competitive, as I said. This is, and especially around the theme, was very special. It's translation, transplantation, and adaptation. And his project fit absolutely into the larger goals and aims of what this project was going to be. So he's affiliated, he's housed in the Institute for Research in the Humanities. The UW-Madison, the UW-Mellon fellowships are a collaboration between the Center for the Humanities and the Institute for Research in the Humanities. But here he's affiliated with the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures and, of course, the Center for South Asia. He earned his PhD from the Department of History at Cornell University in 2017. His research and teaching engaged modern South Asian history, global Islam, and the history of science. He received his MA in South Asian history from Cornell University and his BA in history and Italian from Middlebury College. So a real polyglot, a world scholar. He has one publication that was just accepted and is coming out with a very prestigious journal, Journal of South Asian Studies. And this article is called A Pakistani Homeland for Buddhism, Depicting the Muslim Nation Before Islam. He's currently working on his book manuscript. He's converting his dissertation into a book, and the book is going to be called A Language of Science, Urdu in the Making of Muslim Politics in South Asia. Today he's going to speak to us on the topic of Queen of the East, Urdu literature in Karachi within an Indian Ocean world, 1940 to 47. And this is drawing on his book manuscript. This will be reworked into the book. So please join me in welcoming Andrew Amstutz.
Thank you all very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So first of all, I'd like to thank Vinkat and Lalita and Andrea for the opportunity to present my work here at the Center for South Asia. The paper that I'm going to present today, Queen of the East, was originally part of a dissertation chapter, but I'm planning to rework it to submit as a separate article, so I really look forward to your feedback and comments. And it comes out of my larger book project, which looks at the production of scientific literature in Urdu in the late colonial and early post-colonial era, and the relationship of that to efforts to expand the Urdu language's geographic boundaries and its literary boundaries, particularly in southern India, and what is today Pakistan, and what is today Bangladesh. As will probably become clear, this chapter, this bit of the research is the most literary of all of my chapters, so it certainly was a little bit beyond my training in history of science. So I'd appreciate your comments and feedback, and I'll just jump in. So my talk today explores how Mahmooda Rizvi, an ambitious Urdu author in late colonial Karachi, made a case for the city of Karachi as a new center for Urdu literature within an Indian Ocean world from 1941 to 1947. Mahmooda Rizvi was Karachi's most prominent Urdu writer in the late colonial era, as the port city of Karachi was transformed from the provincial margins of the Urdu sphere into one of the world's largest Urdu-speaking cities after the creation of Pakistan in 1947. Today, I'll examine how Mahmooda Rizvi, this ambitious young Urdu author, narrated her travels across the Arabian Sea, and how she described the natural world and urban change and stylized Urdu prose in the early 1940s to make the case for Karachi as a new global center for prestigious Urdu literature in this late colonial moment. So, I'd like to begin with this striking image of a woman standing on top of the globe. This is a figure of Karachi and also Urdu, personified as Mallika-e Mashriq, or Queen of the East. This image of Karachi as Queen of the East frequently appeared in the 1930s and 1940s on the covers of Urdu textbooks and magazines that Mahmooda Rizvi published in late colonial Karachi. In this image, Karachi is Queen of the East, or Mallika-e Mashriq, stands atop the subcontinent with her feet pointing towards the Middle East and Southeast Asia across the Indian Ocean. This image really gets to the heart of what I want to discuss today, especially Mahmooda Rizvi's ambitions for Karachi as a new hub for Urdu literature facing outwards across the ocean. So much like Bombay, Karachi, the city of Karachi, which you can see here, initially flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a British colonial port that linked Western India with other Indian Ocean cities, especially after the opening of the Suez Canal. And World War II really cemented Karachi's growing importance as a strategic port for the British Empire in between the European and Asian theaters of the war in the early 1940s. Of course, as many of you know, Urdu became the national language of Pakistan after the 1947 partition of British India. However, before 1947, Urdu was not widely spoken in the city, in the port city of Karachi, like in many of the territories that later became Pakistan. Historically, Karachi and the subcontinent's northwestern reaches in the province of Sindh was really distant, both geographically and culturally, from Urdu's North Indian heartland. Instead, Sindhi was widely spoken in Karachi and in the province of Sindh, and also in Karachi, along with Sindhi, Gujarati, and English were widely used in the late colonial era. The 1947 partition rapidly transformed Karachi's demographics from a distant frontier of Urdu into one of the most populous Urdu-speaking cities in the world due to the massive migration of many North Indian Muslims to Karachi, who are often called muhajirs. As a result of these demographic changes in 1947, the history of Urdu in Karachi is usually told as a distinctly Pakistani national story that began in 1947. So today I'd like to give a slightly alternative history of Urdu in Karachi by exploring how the city's initial marginal position on the edges of the Urdu-speaking zone, but on the cusp of an Indian Ocean world, shaped Mahmooda Rizvi's global ambitions in the early 1940s. The subject of my talk, Mahmooda Rizvi, came from a wealthy Sindhi Muslim merchant family. She was educated at Bombay University and at Karachi's DJ Sindh College, and when she was publishing these books in the early 1940s, she was probably in her mid to late 20s. Mahmooda Rizvi's father was a prominent merchant and literary patron in late colonial Sindh. And although she was the daughter of a wealthy merchant with commercial ties across the Indian Ocean, Mahmooda Rizvi often has espoused revolutionary views in her writings, and she even advocated for the murder of wealthy landowners or zamindars in one of her short stories, which I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A. Mahmooda Rizvi was a part of a cohort of Sindhi scholars and Gujarati merchants in late colonial Karachi who formed a branch of the Pan-South Asian Urdu Literary Association, the Anjuman-e Urdu, or the Association for the Advancement of Urdu. And this Urdu Literary Association is the subject of my larger book project. So from 1941 to 1946, in the years immediately before independence and partition, Mahmooda Rizvi wrote 13 Urdu textbooks for schools in Sindh, in which she mixed revolutionary critiques of worldly capitalism, dystopian accounts of urban change, and musings on the natural world. Specifically today, I'll explore two of Rizvi's travel accounts, which were published as textbooks at this time, or as Urdu textbooks. The first was her sea journey from Karachi to Iraq in 1944. The second travel account was an imagined and esoteric journey between the Valley of Life and the City of Death. So Mahmooda Rizvi led a branch of this Urdu literary organization, the Anjuman, in Karachi from 1941 to 1946, as the city's population and industrial capacity rapidly grew during World War II. Rizvi occupied a really unique position in this Urdu literary organization and really in the world of Urdu letters in Sindh. She was one of the few women in the Anjuman's leadership in the 1940s, and she published more books than any other single author in the Anjuman in the early 1940s. What makes her publishing record so remarkable was that Rizvi published during the paper restrictions and the colonial censorship of World War II. And a constant refrain in Urdu advertisements for her books was that she was, quote, the Adiba-e Sindh, or the leading woman author of Sindh, who was paving a verdant road for Urdu in the deserts of Sindh. So who exactly was the intended audience for Mahmooda Rizvi's textbooks in the early 1940s? So before this time period, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Urdu was not widely taught in Sindh's schools, which instead focused on English, Sindhi, and Gujarati. In the early 1940s, the Karachi Anjuman petitioned Sindh's Department of Education to institutionalize the Urdu language, or to institutionalize Urdu language classes in Sindh's primary and secondary schools. Along with these petitions, Mahmooda Rizvi provided a wide range of Urdu textbooks for Sindh. And in response to these petitions and also the sort of deluge of Urdu textbooks from Mahmooda Rizvi, the Provincial Education Department in Sindh stocked all school libraries with Rizvi's books starting in 1943. So more broadly, in addition to these sort of local textbook goals, Mahmooda Rizvi made a case for Karachi as a worthy new center for Urdu literature to a pan-South Asian audience. Her books were reviewed in popular Urdu periodicals in Lahore, Delhi, Lucknow, and Hyderabad in the early 1940s. And what's important to remember is that even though we know that Pakistan was created and Karachi became Pakistan's first capital and a major Urdu-speaking city, in this late colonial moment, before Pakistan was inevitable, or even the boundaries of what Pakistan would be were not established, the alleged provincial backwater of Karachi would have seemed like an extremely unlikely place for a new center for prestigious Urdu literature. Therefore, Mahmooda Rizvi's stylized observations of the natural world and urban change that drew on Persian poetry, English romantic poetry, and revolutionary communism would have been an important way to, in many ways, place Karachi on the map in a very dramatic fashion, or place Karachi on Urdu's literary map in a rather dramatic fashion. Finally, by promoting Karachi as Queen of the East, Rizvi cultivated devotion to Karachi from Urdu authors and poets from across the Indian subcontinent. Historians have noted a relative lack of scholarship on the role of language devotion in the Urdu sphere in comparison to robust studies of the representation of other South Asian languages, such as Tamil and Hindi, as goddess and mother. That in comparison to this, there aren't as much scholarship on the role of devotion, language devotion, in Urdu. So in response, I argue that in the years immediately before partition, the city of Karachi witnessed an outpouring of images and books, personifying the city as a new Urdu Mallika-e Mashriq, or Queen of the East, worthy of devotion from Urdu writers from across South Asia. And in order to explain this, I'll now address Rizvi's two travel accounts. So in 1944, Mahmooda Rizvi traveled from Karachi to Iraq by ship with her family across the Arabian Sea. And she published an account of her 3-month journey as Dunya Scheherazade, or the world of Scheherazade. And this travelogue combined philosophical musings on the ocean with Rizvi's visit to Muslim graves and detailed accounts of Iraq's recent history in the British Empire. And the title of this account, The World of Scheherazade, of course references the famous narrator Scheherazade of the 1001 Nights. And Rizvi drew simultaneously on older Islamic ties between India and Iraq in this account, along with both countries' position in the British Empire. Dunya-e Scheherazade was part travelogue, part observational account of the ocean, and part history textbook. Of course, in post-colonial Pakistan, there's a well-documented cultural turn towards the Middle East. However, in this 1944 moment, Rizvi connected Karachi to Iraq in a different way. Specifically, she hoped that her book would inspire more trading opportunities, or more Indian interest, or Indian interest in Iraq, and trading opportunities between Karachi and Iraq. So in this travel account, The World of Scheherazade, Rizvi wrote down her daily observations of the changing color of the sea, the night sky, and the varied landscapes that she encountered, along with extended discussions of the poverty of seafaring communities in the Persian Gulf. The opening passage of this 1944 travelogue gives a real sense of the role of the ocean in Karachi's global ties and Rizvi's thought. And you can see a quote here, and I'll read part of it. So she wrote that the Arabian Sea is that silent sign of the future, and that alluring anticipation of what is to come, that noisily announces its arrival with the proud and playful waves that at every moment keep washing the shores of Karachi. This view of the sea comes clearly from the window in my room, and it had already become second nature for me to be absorbed by this intoxicating view. I have tried to understand the sea's secrets, but until today I've not been able to grasp them. Therefore, these crashing waves that were born from the Tigris and the Euphrates in Iraq, they first passed the Arabian Peninsula to arrive at the Persian Gulf. Then from there, these waves crashed into the shores of Karachi, where they came to rest. From the very beginning, the sea has been the font of my imagination and the source for worthy lessons. Of course, in classical Persian and Urdu poetry, the ocean could represent themes to record her own travels across the Arabian Sea. And she often returned to the Arabian Sea as the font of her literary inspiration in the rest of her writings. For example, in a 1945 issue of her magazine, she wrote that, quote, "Going to my special window, I stood there deeply tired from the conflicts of life. At this time, my glance fell upon the thunderous Arabian Sea, which is the repository of my imagination and the greatest mine of my commentary." And throughout her travelogue, Rizvi recorded her daily observations of the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf as she traveled from Sharjah to Bahrain to Abadan in coastal Iran, before journeying up the Shatt al-Arab River in Iraq to Basra, from where she took the train to Iraq. So Persianate tropes of natural beauty were crucial tools for Rizvi to conceptualize the economic developments that she witnessed and that she wrote about in Urdu prose during her ocean journey. For example, upon arriving at the Iranian port city of Abadan, she described modern oil refineries in terms of the lush valleys of Persian poetry. And you can see this quote here. And she wrote, "Today, after 13 days, land finally came into view. The natural scenes here are extremely charming, since thanks to oil factories, this area is populated. Therefore, every evening, the port was awakened with activity, and this area was extremely lush and green to such an extent that without exaggeration, I was reminded of heavenly Kashmir." Here she compares sort of a modern oil refinery on the coast of Iran to the lush valley of Kashmir, which is quite a connection. However, observing the ocean was not all Mahmooda Rizvi did during her journeys. Once in Iraq, she recorded her interactions there, with particular interest in the intermarriage between Iraqi Jewish and Indian Muslim families, many of whom had business ties to her father in Karachi. Throughout her journey, Rizvi met with literary contacts in Iraq, many of whom were Indian Muslim women whose families worked in Iraq, but whom Rizvi had met when they traveled back to South Asia, back to India through Karachi. And many of these women that she met actually were part of the trans-regional network of authors who contributed to Rizvi's magazines in late colonial Karachi. Evocative of the sort of competing global literary influences on Mahmooda Rizvi's writing, she recorded that she was thrilled to meet mixed Indian and Russian families in Iraq, and she narrated her great enjoyment in discussing a range of topics, particularly political and educational topic, with the Russian wives of 2 Indian men in Iraq. And in the world of Scheherazade, Rizvi really developed an elaborate comparative framework for Iraq and India, or Hindustan as she called it, within the British Empire. And in building her comparative framework for Iraq and India within the British Empire in this late colonial moment, she sometimes drew on older Muslim ties, but she very much also sort of placed them within a contemporary British imperial moment. For example, in one passage, she described the Iraqi king as merely a badshah, a king, whereas the British ruler was the Shahenshah, or the emperor, suggesting Iraq's place along with India within a wider British imperium. Underlining this subsidiary relationship, Rizvi observed that despite the alleged independence of Iraq, Transjordan, Egypt, and Syria, that in fact these Arab nation states had no more independence within the British and French empires, in her words, than, quote, any of our local desi riyasat, or princely states in Hindustan. In this travel account, Rizvi spent considerable time describing the urban geography of Baghdad. She especially focused on her visits to prominent Muslim graves in Baghdad, and this attention to Baghdad and its sort of prominent graves is quite interesting in comparison to her description of Karachi as a city of death that I'll discuss in a few minutes. So Rizvi foregrounded graves in Baghdad that she felt were neglected and were particularly lesson worthy for her readers in India. Exemplifying this, Rizvi focused on the graves associated with the epic tale, The 1001 Nights, especially Queen Zubaydah, the consort of Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid caliph who figures in early versions of The 1001 Nights. Rizvi wrote that, quote, going a bit further, the grave of that special character of Alif Layla and the most famous queen of Iraq, Zubaydah, comes. The stories of 1001 Nights memorialize her royal greatness, but her grave was in disrepair. So explaining her great sadness at the neglect of Iraq's famous queen, and in fact, I think Mahmooda Rizvi was mistaken that this probably wasn't in fact Zubaydah's grave, but Rizvi thought it was. But explaining her sadness at the neglect of Iraq's famous queen, Rizvi wrote, coming here, the sense of the instability of the world passed through me. The situation of Noor Jahan, the great Mughal queen of India, and Zubaydah Khatun, the queen of Iraq, are almost the same. Both in their lifetimes ruled the hearts of kings. They were helpers in completing the affairs of state, and now, after death, going and standing beside their abandoned graves, I had the same empty feeling. So as you can tell here, Rizvi had visiting this grave had quite an emotional impact on Mahmooda Rizvi, which of course raises the question of why she titled her travel account to Iraq, The World of Scheherazade, taking up the name of the famous narrator of 1001 Nights. Said another way, what was the significance of the title of Scheherazade for Mahmooda Rizvi herself, given that she was a globally ambitious Urdu author, but who was largely forgotten in the Urdu sphere? Of course, in 1001 Nights, as you know, storytelling was necessary for Scheherazade to survive. Telling stories was the way she kept the king from killing her. And I think in a sort of a parallel fashion, during this turbulent era of political and economic change in Karachi, Rizvi turned to storytelling and writing to document her own place in a changing world. So before turning to Rizvi's second travel account, it's important to assess the role of this personification, this sort of publicity of Karachi as Mallika-e Mashriq, or Queen of the East, and cultivating a wider Urdu audience for the city in the early 1940s. Under Rizvi's direction, the missionary zeal of the Anjuman was focused on women readers and non-Urdu speakers in Sindh. And she seems to have been held in quite a lot of regard by her Urdu literary peers across the subcontinent. One of her peers wrote that, quote, the famine of Urdu writers, the restrictions on paper during World War II, the inflation in the price of all things except the blood of humans, and then to have the publication of Urdu texts from the province of Sindh. This could be achieved only by that person who is brave in the face of the challenges of life. That figure of courage is Mahmooda Rizvi. So in many ways, she was quite a celebrated person in this sort of late colonial moment. And of course, the Anjuman often expressed its aspirations to make Karachi a new center for Urdu literature under the rubric of Karachi as Queen of the East, or Mallika-e Mashriq, in poetry, advertisements, and book covers, one of which you can see here. And in this formulation, Karachi was a feminized cosmopolitan port city reigning over the Indian Ocean, to which Urdu poets and writers from across the Indian subcontinent owed their devotion. So what exactly was the response to these bold claims for this provincial city of Karachi as Queen of the East? And the Anjuman's monthly magazine recorded the submissions of poems and articles from readers across India celebrating Karachi as a new global hub for Urdu. And of course, they only would have published poetry and articles that sort of fit within this relatively celebratory framework, but I think it's still interesting. Exemplifying this, Akhtar Rizvani, who was a North Indian poet who visited Karachi in 1943, penned an ode to the city as Queen of the East, which you can see here. And I've given also the cover of the magazine in which this poem, Queen of the East, appeared, so you get a sense, and it's titled Hindustani, which is another often name for Urdu in this era. And it sort of shows the sort of global ambitions of this project. And in this poem, which was written to Karachi as Queen of the East, he wrote, the place of color and perfume and the bulwark of friendly people. According to me, Karachi is the masterpiece of the ages. And it's Karachi's lap, the spirit of a boundless sea, is the meeting place of a retinue of Afghans from one direction and the spirit of intoxication from the ocean. What is coming to Karachi if not coming to a ziyarat gah, or a place of pilgrimage? And I'd be happy to discuss in more detail this trans-regional network of Urdu poets that Rizvi cultivated by publicizing Urdu, or publicizing Karachi as Mallika-e Mashriq in the Q&A. And I also want to emphasize that Karachi was not the only city that the Anjuman celebrated in the 1930s and 1940s as they attempted to expand the geographic and literary boundaries for Urdu. They also focused quite a bit on Aurangabad and Hyderabad and the Deccan, and on Dhaka and Calcutta. So what exactly were the origins of this title, Mallika-e Mashriq, or Queen of the East, for Karachi? Of course, the title, Queen of the East, seems to suggest a distinctly Eastern or Asian heritage for the city, but actually, and probably not very unsurprisingly, it had a very British colonial origin. Referring to Karachi as Queen of the East allegedly originated in a quote from Charles Napier, who was the British conqueror of Sindh in the 1840s. As Napier left Karachi after rather brutally conquering Sindh, he proclaimed that "You will be the glory of the East. I wish that I could come again and see you in your grandeur, O Karachi." A century later, in the early 1940s, Rizvi appropriated what Napier, the colonial conqueror, had said of Karachi and rendered it in Urdu as Mallika-e Mashriq. Instead of thinking of this title, Queen of the East, as an indigenization of a former sort of colonial title for Karachi, in many ways, I think Rizvi Urduized or Persianized the British conqueror's title for Karachi as Queen of the East and used it in a sense for another kind of conquest of the city, this time for Urdu. So, in order to better understand the implications of Rizvi's stylized observations of the natural world and personification of Karachi, in the remainder of my talk, or in this final part of the talk, I'll turn to an earlier, less conventional travel account. In 1942, Mahmooda Rizvi published an Urdu prose volume called Lalazar, which you can see here, that reinterpreted her vacation travels between the port city of Karachi and the mountains into an esoteric night journey between life and death. So this is her second travel account, although quite different from the other one. The book Lalazar was named after both the Lalazar port neighborhood in Karachi, which you can see labeled on the map here, which bordered the city's dockyards, and Lalazar, a popular summer vacation spot in the Kagan Valley in British India's northwestern frontier province, which is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. Rizvi lived in Karachi near the port neighborhood of Lalazar, and she vacationed in the other Lalazar, the other place named Lalazar, in the mountains. If her first travelogue, The World of Scheherazade, documented Rizvi's physical journey across the Arabian Sea, the second travel account, Lalazar, tracked a very different kind of journey every night between the Valley of Life and the City of Death, as she observed the night sky. And just to give you a sense of the contrast she's drawing, these are contemporary pictures of Lalazar in the mountains and the port of Karachi. So in the book Lalazar, this 1942 sort of esoteric and rather sort of abstract travel account, Rizvi adopted the persona of the soul bird of classical Persian poetry. And in each chapter, she recorded her imagined flight every night, either between the two Lalazars, the urban port neighborhood in the valley, or between Karachi, personified as this cosmopolitan Queen of the East, or Karachi imagined as a dystopian silent city, or Sheher-e-Khamoshan, which of course, this other title for Karachi, is Silent City, or Sheher-e-Khamoshan, is also a term for grave, is a euphemism for a graveyard. The book Lalazar consisted of 65 chapters with little discernible chronology. In many ways, it's a stream of consciousness text as she moves between sort of Karachi personified as a cosmopolitan city, Queen of the East, or between Karachi as a silent city or city of death. Rizvi dedicated Lalazar not to Karachi as Queen of the East, which was the image of the city that I began this talk with, but instead she dedicated it to, quote, the plunderer, the silent city, which was swallowed up paradise until the day of resurrection. And in each of these chapters, Rizvi utilized Persian and Urdu's really rich garden vocabulary to critique Karachi's urban expansion and industrialization. As you can probably already guess, Rizvi wrote in a style that does not read particularly fluidly when translated in English, so please bear with me. In this book, Rizvi responded to the economic dislocations of World War II. as Karachi rapidly expanded in particular as Karachi rapidly expanded and industrialized during the war, idealized writings about the natural world emerged as a potent means to critique this urbanization, and of course also to get around the colonial censors by writing in a fairly abstract manner. And Rizvi's stylized Urdu prose reflected her own wide-ranging education in British Romantic poetry, Shia esoteric thought, Urdu progressive writing, and also communist literature. And the specific figures that Rizvi invoked in her Urdu prose, the nightingale, the soul bird, roses, and the ocean, were of course not new. These are standard tropes and themes in both Urdu and Persian poetry. However, Rizvi reinterpreted these stock figures to present Karachi as an urban dystopia veering towards ruin. And of course, she very clearly drew on an earlier generation of English Romantic poetry that was critical of urbanization, and she also drew on Urdu progressive writing and Persian poetry. And in some ways, she anticipates the later Pakistani Urdu poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz. Almost all of the chapters in Lalazar began in the same place, Rizvi gazing out from her window at the setting sun with an elaborate description of the changing hue of the sky as the sun set. Then, after observing the dusk, Rizvi would contemplate the universe before launching into a meditation on the difficulties of life. For example, in one chapter, which was evocatively titled Address to the City of Silence, or the sort of deathly city, she told the story of a bird flying between the beautiful valley and the deathly city. And remember, she took on as her sort of autobiographical persona this figure of the bird flying between the valley and the city. The chapter dramatically began, quote, "Mysterious city of silence, do not give me moral lessons. I know that the reality of death is within your grasp." And despite her fear, Rizvi anticipated that her soul at every moment could break free and without care, like the bird in flight, fly from the dreadful city to the valley of Lalazar. However, Rizvi could not long escape the deathly city. Turning from the beautiful valley to the city of her birth, she admonished Karachi, quote, "For your nightmarish walls and tragic atmosphere made this mortal body tremble for some time." Despite the shared name of Lalazar between the urban neighborhood and the lush valley, Rizvi questioned, quote, but these imagined pictures of verdant valleys, what is the connection between this dreadful city to the dream world of the verdant valley? And here, this tension between the two different Lalazars that she actually journeyed between inspired her often oblique economic critiques. Rizvi scorned Karachi, since, quote, "the secret of life is not found in your temporary mortality. No, eternal life is not found in your lap. You are a brown, hard grave, you, Karachi, are the queen of dust." Thus, Karachi was transformed from a queen of the East into a deathly queen of dust in Rizvi's writings. And of course, this representation of Karachi as a deathly silent city is an interesting counterpoint to her earlier celebration of Baghdad as a city of illustrious Muslim graves. And Mahmooda Rizvi used these stylized observations of the night sky, the deathly city, and the beautiful valley to obliquely criticize economic exploitation in this late colonial moment. In a subsequent chapter, she reinterpreted her own personification and her sort of cosmopolitan personification of Karachi as Queen of the East to foreground these economic exclusions. In this later chapter, Rizvi began, quote, "On this memorial evening, I still remember for one week of vacation, I traveled to the Queen of the East, which is a title that sophisticated scholars call Karachi." Initially, Rizvi seemed to embrace this sort of cosmopolitan imaginary of Karachi as Queen of the East. And she went on at length about the beauty of the city and its urban developments. But then her musings on the city's splendor were interrupted by a heartrending commercial cry of pain. Karachi, she wrote, quote, "After a little while I realized that this cry of pain was the voice of an unlucky laborer who the demon of capitalism had seized, and who was being persecuted by the story's antagonist, a wealthy merchant." And the rest of this short story, Rizvi narrated the persecution of a Muslim laborer by a Hindu merchant under the harsh gaze of the universe. And I'd be happy to talk about the religious and communal implications of Rizvi's writings in the Q&A. As you can probably already tell, Lalazar produced both awe and confusion amongst Urdu readers. In his book review of Mahmooda Rizvi's writings, Hazrat Niaz Fatehpuri, who is the editor of a prominent literary journal in Lucknow, concluded that he would like to ask Rizvi, quote, "Why did you write this volume? And under the inspiration of which other writings?" And I'd give the suggestion that you should also include this discussion in the second edition. Despite the confusion that this rather esoteric travelogue account produced, Lalazar was sold by the Anjuman across the subcontinent and became part of the Urdu organization, became part of its submission of Urdu textbooks to Sindh's Department of Education in the early 1940s. So in conclusion, Mahmooda Rizvi's Urdu register is really distinctive in its mixture of esoteric notes, dystopian themes, and global ambitions from an alleged provincial backwater of Karachi in the early 1940s. So why did Rizvi syncretize and mix such a wide range of genres and themes, many of which were assumed to be mutually contradictory or exclusive? So in part, I theorize that the ambitious scope of Rizvi's books was motivated to prove, both to her local audience in Karachi and to Urdu readers across South Asia, that Karachi was a new worthy center of Urdu literary production. Said another way, before the creation of Pakistan, it would have been hard for most Urdu poets sitting in North India to imagine the distant port of Karachi as an Urdu-speaking city, let alone a prestigious hub for Urdu literature. Therefore, in this late colonial moment, Rizvi strove to prove the city's intellectual mettle through her books, which melded global travel, Islam, economic critique, and stylized prose. In turn, despite the apparent tension between Rizvi's celebration of Karachi as a cosmopolitan Indian Ocean city as Queen of the East and as a dystopian city of death, in many ways, these two images of the city probably constituted a productive tension in advancing Urdu and Urdu education in late colonial Sindh. So I'd like to conclude with this figure of Queen of the East with which I began my talk. The promotion of Karachi as a new Urdu Queen of the East coincided with other iterations of women as symbols of the nation and language around the globe. Especially in South Asia, the iconic figure of Mother India, or Bharat Mata, which you can see here. This image of Mother India, in which India was embodied as a Hindu goddess, was a central theme in the Indian nationalist movement, and the figure of Karachi as Queen of the East emerged really a generation after the figure of Bharat Mata or Mother India, and could in some ways be seen to be in conversation or in response to it. What makes this figure of the Queen of the East distinctive amongst the gendered representations of modern South Asian languages is its paradoxical relationship to place. In contrast to the personification of goddesses who reigned over an Indian heartland for Hindi or Tamil, Karachi was, of course, geographically distant from Urdu's North Indian base. Karachi as a new literary Mallika-e Mashriq, or Queen of the East, became an important or an influential counter-narrative to Mother India that carved out an alternative space for Urdu facing outwards across the Indian Ocean on the eve of partition. And in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about how Rizvi's projects in late colonial Karachi both informed Urdu nationalism in Pakistan after 1947, and how they also her projects moved in a very different direction. Thank you very much.